Okay, so Tunguska. I think we should talk some more about Tunguska, because Tunguska is going to basically give us a considerable amount of insight into our Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Okay, here we go. Here's the blast zone right here, sort of just north and a little to the west of Lake Baikal. And that's right at the edge of the taiga forests. North of there is tundra, south of there is forest. So if it had been, as we think we talked about maybe last week, if it had been any further north, you wouldn't have had the pattern of tree destruction that has yielded up so much insight into the nature of this event. So here's a closer look. You can see Lake Baikal right there. And these are a series of in other words, what they did was the scientists who have been studying this early on, they actually went and got eyewitness accounts. And they began to catalog the eyewitness accounts. Like, what did you see? And they proceeded to describe what they saw. And one of the things that was of greatest interest to the scientists was, where did it come from, right? And so the direction that it came from evolved to finally this longest arrow here shows the greatest amount of its length is representative of the greatest amount of eyewitness accounts that are now consistent with that being the general direction of that the thing emerged from, the object. And this object, I mean, this image, if follow my cursor right around here, is what they call the butterfly. And within this butterfly, all of the forest was blown down, right? So this area of almost total destruction within there. And you'll know this, where it says Kulik's route, that was Leonid Kulik, who was the first scientist to actually reach the site of devastation. And I've always thought, since I first started learning about this, decades ago, was, God, what this needs to be a movie or a mini series. I mean, it could be as compelling as the Game of Thrones, but every bit of it true. The heroic effort, repeated, the first efforts and the failures and the repeated efforts, where he finally got this arduous journey to this remote region, and he mounted the ridge and looked over the ridge, and as far as the eye could see, a massive sea of blown down forest. And his observations and his impressions and his emotional reaction to what he was seeing is compelling stuff. And it really could. I mean, there's so much interesting stuff out there that could serve as that could be presented now in story form, that it's to me almost tragic that there's such now little originality in Hollywood when you have this tremendous untapped reservoir of stuff. And this is just one example. I could probably come up with 10 more examples of things, but this is one example. Tell the story of Leonid Kulik in The Mystery of the Tunguska. Open with the scene of the Tungusi tribesmen just going about their daily routine, the reindeer herders and stuff, there at their huts, gathering food from their gardens, tending their reindeer, getting up in the morning, sun's coming up, and then suddenly the heavens opened up and fire pours out, and this tremendous thing happens. And now it's going to take, another 19 years before Leonid Kulik actually makes it to the site. And some of the details of that story are pretty amazing. Anyways, let's go on. It shows Kulik's route here as he came in and explored. And, so this was a situation where day after day, he's traversing this landscape of utter devastation. So what he was seeing was unique. Not too many human beings had seen anything like this alive on the earth at that time or since then. I mean, the closest you might get to this would be, maybe the destruction of Hiroshima or Nagasaki by an atomic bomb, or perhaps if you were walking the aftermath of the Great Chicago Fire, although the Great Chicago Fire in its area of devastation was minuscule compared to this. Boom, let's go. Krinov, one of the best books on this, translated from the Russian back in 1966. I think probably this was maybe the second or third book I read on the subject. The following appeared in the paper Sibir on July 2nd, 1908. Now get this, July 2nd. So it's only 3 days after the event, written by a correspondent named Kulesh. At the beginning of the 9th hour, in the morning of 17 June, which is the old calendar there. This corresponds to 30th of June in our modern Gregorian calendar, just so don't get confused there. At the beginning of the 9th hour, in the morning of 17 June, a most unusual phenomena of nature was observed here. In the village of Nizhny Kralinsk, in the northwest, quite high above the horizon, the peasants saw a body shining very brightly, too bright for the naked eye, with a bluish-white light. It moved vertically downwards for about 10 minutes. The body was in the form of a pipe, that is, cylindrical. Okay, so I'm going to stop the share there.
10 minutes. Wow.
Well, as you're going to see, this, of course, is not accurate.
Okay.
I was going to point that out. It was not 10 minutes. That would have been something if it was.
Yeah, I was going to say, they're seeing it from way out in space.
Yeah, that would. Yeah, no, not 10 minutes. But see, this is the press. This was copied from a press. Three days after, you've got,
yes,
so and so said so and so and so and so, and they report on the story. Then the story is actually,
put in a book.
Yeah,
and then somebody has to translate the book, and yeah.
So okay. Right. It was not 10 minutes, but it was actually a pretty long time. Depends on where you were. Like, if, for example, if you were in an area, say, to the southwest, when that thing is coming in, you had the potential to see it much longer than if you were beyond the trajectory of it, and you basically maybe saw a distant light in the sky. But then, of course, once it exploded now, if you were looking in that direction, you would have seen a brilliant ball, and depending on how far away you were, that ball could have been as bright as the sun or even much brighter. But I want to call attention to this idea of a cylindrical pipe. When I was a kid, my grandfather grew up in rural Sweden, and there were, huge lakes there. And he told this story to me multiple times, that one time he was out walking, and it was at night. I don't remember what he was doing when he was a kid. And he said this big, he called it a pipe. He said it was like a big tube or a pipe, and it was on fire. And he watched it go over his head, and then it went down into the lake that he was walking by. And, he told me that multiple times, because that's why I remember it quite well. And that always, I remember I found that imagery. I was trying to, as a kid, maybe 6-7 years old, the first time he told it to me, and I'm trying to envision, what the hell is he talking about? I probably didn't think specifically in those terms at 6 or 7, but that's what I was wondering. And if I had the words at the vocabulary at the time, that's probably how I would have phrased it to myself. But see, years now later, I'm still thinking about that, and having now seen a number of, fireball phenomena myself, and having read so many accounts of what people saw, I'm convinced that, yeah, that's what he saw. And it was probably an illusion, thinking that it went into the lake, because one of the things about when you see these fireballs, especially if they're descending to the horizon, is they always look way closer than they actually are. People are always thinking, oh, it was just over the next hill. You see that. But then you realize, you do the calculations, the entry trajectory calculations, and the damn thing was 40 miles away. But it was right over the next hill. So we all got out and went in our carriages and rode over looking for the thing. Well, no, you still would have need to have gone another 30, 40, 50 miles. But this is a very common thing to think that it was.
Yeah, especially if you couldn't see, if the lake went to the horizon.
Right. Okay, so what they saw then was this thing that was a body in the form of a pipe that is cylindrical. Then it goes on to say that it was hot and dry when the shining body approached the ground, which was covered with forest at this point. It seemed to be pulverized, and in its place a huge cloud of black smoke was formed, and a loud crash, not like thunder, but as if from the fall of large stones or from gunfire was heard. All the buildings shook, and at the same time, a forked tongue of flame broke through the cloud. All the inhabitants of the village ran out into the street in panic. The old women wept. Everyone thought that the end of the world was approaching. In the end, it was decided to send a messenger to Kurensk to find out the meaning of this phenomena. Now, when we get into these accounts of these celestial phenomena, over and over and over again, common theme, people think it's the end of the world. Right? So then there was a letter to Kulik. This was one of the critical letters. This was sent to Leonid Kulik. It was dated the 21st of November, 1921. And this is what the letter said. The Evenki people who are camping on the Podkamennaya Tunguska describe how strong air pressure laid low a strip of forest and killed several reindeer belonging to one of the Evenki, Ivan Ilyich. Now, that was the first thing that alerted him to there might be something interesting going on up there, because he had the assignment of documenting these meteorite falls in Russia. That was kind of one of the things he had been tasked with. And so he was now putting out there that he was interested in anything that people had seen or had witnessed or anything. This letter represents his first awareness of the Tunguska event. Now we get to Astapowicz, who wrote one of the first articles in English after, because the first scientific articles didn't come out until the late 20s and early 1930s in Russia. And then, of course, we have the Depression setting in, and there just wasn't the scientific attention or resources or anything to really investigate this thing at that time, right? So this was from 1934. This was published in the Quarterly Journal of the Royal Meteorological Society, and the title of the article was Airwaves Caused by the Fall of the Meteorite on 30th June 1908 in Central Siberia. And here's the quote. The flight and fall of the meteorite on the 30th of June, 1908, amongst the greatest meteoric phenomena known to mankind, must occupy one of the foremost places because of the magnitude of the phenomena accompanying its movement through the atmosphere. It is unlikely that our generation may again be witnesses of a similar meteoric phenomena. If it had occurred 4 hours, 47 minutes later, when the city of Leningrad would have lain on the same parallel near the center of the explosion, our knowledge of it would probably have been considerably more extensive. On July 13th, 1908, and I'm going to guess that this is probably, again, I'm not sure if this is which calendar this is, but it was reprinted in Krinov's book Giant Meteorites that devoted a whole section to the Tunguska event, right? So this was one of the Krasnoyarets was a newspaper. So this was dated July 13th, reprinted in Giant Meteorites. So this again is a report. It may not be exactly accurate, but it begins to kind of convey the sense. The first early glimmerings of understanding here. Kozhemsk village, the 17th. So the 17th, again, of course, is the old calendar. An extraordinary atmospheric phenomena was noticed in this region. At 7:43 a.m., a noise as a strong wind was heard, followed immediately by a fearful crash accompanied by a subterranean shock which caused buildings to tremble. One had the impression that some huge beam or heavy stone had struck the building. This was followed by two further equally forceful blows. The interval between the first and the third blows was accompanied by an extraordinary underground roar, like the sound of a number of trains passing simultaneously over the rails. And then, for 5 or 6 minutes, followed by a sound like artillery fire. Between 50 and 60 bangs, becoming gradually fainter while the ground trembled. That would be leave quite an impression on a person, I would think. And this is something, again, that we hear repeatedly, is this idea that there was a subterranean component to this thing. It wasn't merely atmospheric. It was translated literally into the crust of the earth, and people felt like it was moving through the crust of the earth, describing it was as if simultaneously these number of trains passing over the rails, except under the ground. I find that very interesting. And then when we get into the
last week that was the center of the Siberian traps there, so there could be all kinds of strange faulting and
yes. Structures
underneath, that could have been affected by that.
Exactly, Brad. Exactly. As eyewitnesses relate, it goes on, before the first bangs were heard, a heavenly body of a fiery appearance cut across the sky from south to north, inclined to the northeast. Neither its size nor shape could be made out, owing to its speed and particularly its unexpectedness. However, many people in different villages distinctly saw that when the flying object touched the horizon, a huge flame shot up that cut the sky in two. The glow was so strong that it was reflected in rooms whose windows faced north. Apparently, the glow continued for at least a minute, since many peasants in the fields noticed it. The bangs were heard as soon as the tongue of flame disappeared. On the island opposite the village, horses began to whinny and cows to low and run wildly about. One had the impression that the earth was just about to gape open and everything would be swallowed up in the abyss. Fearful bangs resounded from somewhere, shaking the earth, and the invisibility of the source inspired a kind of superstitious terror. People were literally dumbfounded. So it goes on. Here's from a newspaper article by Ponomarev, reporting from the village of Nizhny Ilimsk at 7:20 a.m. A mighty noise was heard, resolving into thunder cracks. Although the sky was cloudless at the time, the noise caused houses to shake. Many inhabitants saw a fiery body like a beam shoot from south to northwest above the ground before they heard the thunder. Immediately afterwards, the bang was heard, and in the place where the fiery body had disappeared, a tongue of fire appeared, followed by a pillar of smoke.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, doesn't it? Vasily Akhshin of the Evenki people to one of the investigating scientists early on in 1926, right? So this is what happened to Vasily. He woke up at the moment when the tent, he was a reindeer herder, by the way. He woke up at the moment when the tent was torn away and he was thrown aside by a powerful jolt, but did not lose consciousness. The ground shook and loud, prolonged roaring was heard. Everything round about was shrouded in smoke and fog from the burning, falling trees. Eventually, the roar died away, the wind dropped, but the forest went on burning. All three set off in search of the reindeer, which, at the time of the catastrophe, had rushed away. Many of them did not come back and could not be traced. There was an account of some of the children that was actually set down years later who had camped near, not inside the radius of destruction, but outside, right? Because anybody who would have been inside that radius of destruction would not have, within that butterfly of destruction, would not have been giving an eyewitness account, obviously. So these children, the account of these children is that they were awakened by a loud rumble. Explosions were heard everywhere. The earth trembled, and there was a loud cracking noise. A terrible storm, during which they could hardly keep on their feet, flattened the forest near their tent. Far away towards the north, a kind of cloud was visible. And then testimony of one of the local Tunguska people who was living in a nearby village, probably some 20 miles to 30 miles from the epicenter. So he was far enough away that obviously he wasn't killed, but this is what he recalls. I don't remember the year exactly, but more than 20 years ago, when the fallow land was being plowed up, I was sitting on the porch of the house at the trading station of Vanavara at breakfast time and looking towards the north. I had just raised my axe to hoop a cask when suddenly in the north, the sky was split in two, and high above the forest, the whole northern part of the sky appeared to be covered with fire. At that moment, I felt a great heat, as if my shirt had caught fire. I wanted to pull off my shirt and throw it away, but at that moment, there was a mighty bang in the sky, and a powerful crash was heard. I was thrown to the ground about 3 sagines, which I think, as I recall, was about 28 feet. I was thrown to the ground about 3 sagines away from the porch, and for a moment I lost consciousness. My wife ran out and carried me into the hut. The crash was followed by a noise like stones falling from the sky, or guns firing. The earth trembled, and when I lay on the ground, I covered my head because I was afraid that stones might hit it. At the moment when the sky opened, a hot wind as from a cannon blew past the huts from the north. Now here's the testimony of Semenov's daughter, Kosolapova. I was 19, and when the meteorite fell, I was at the trading station at Vanavara. Marfa was a friend of hers, and I had come to the spring for water. Marfa began to draw water, and I was standing beside her facing north. Suddenly, before me, I saw the sky in the north open to the ground, and fire poured out. We were terrified, but the sky closed again, and immediately afterwards, bangs like gunshots were heard. We thought that stones were falling from the sky and rushed off in terror, leaving our pail by the spring. I ran with my head down and covered because I was afraid that stones might fall on it. When we reached the house, we saw my father, Semenov, lying unconscious near the barn opposite the porch of the house. Marfa and I carried him into the hut. We were terribly frightened at the time, for the fire was brighter than the sun. During the bangs, the earth and the huts trembled greatly. The noises, at first, were very, very loud and seemed to be right above our heads, and then they became quieter and quieter. From another letter to Kulik in 1935-1936 by from the village of Kezhma, again just outside the butterfly of destruction, Naumenko was the author of this. He says, it was about 8 a.m. on the 17th or 18th of June, 1908. The day was unusually clear, and not a single cloud was to be seen. No wind stirred, and there was absolute silence. Suddenly, far off, still hardly audible, was heard the sound of thunder. It made us look up involuntarily in every direction. The sound seemed to come from beyond the river Angara and became rapidly louder. There was something extraordinary about it. The first fairly faint crash resounded, but when I turned quickly in the direction of the crash, I saw that the sun's rays were crossed by a broad, fiery white band on the right side of its rays. On the left side, towards the north, an irregularly shaped, brilliant white somewhat elongated mass was flying into the taiga with a diameter far greater than the moon's. Approximately 2 to 3 seconds, maybe more, after the first faint crash, a second louder crash of thunder resounded, as loud as that generally heard during a storm. After the second crash, the ball was no longer visible, but its tail, or rather the streamer, was now completely on the left side of the sun's rays. Then, after a shorter interval of time than that between the first and second crashes, the third thunder crash occurred. This was so loud, as though there were several crashes all mingled together within it, that the whole ground trembled and shook. An echo, like a continuous deafening roar, resounded through the taiga. Indeed, it seemed through the whole taiga of vast Siberia. The carpenters, after the first and second crashes, had crossed themselves in stupefaction. When the third crash resounded, they fell backwards from the building onto the chips of wood. Some of them were so stunned and utterly terrified that I had to calm them down and reassure them. We all abandoned work and went into the village. There, whole crowds of local inhabitants were gathered in the streets in terror, talking about the phenomena. So this is an account by one Corcoran, who was sailing down the river Angara, not far from the village of Bogushani, which, you can actually find on a map. I found it to try to get the geography. In the north, a pale bluish light glowed, and from the south, a fiery body that was considerably larger than the sun and left a broad, bright streamer behind it flew across the sky. Then such a cannonade broke out that all the workmen who were in the boat rushed to hide in the cabin, forgetting all about the danger that threatened from the rapids. The first bangs were faint, but became progressively louder. The sound effect, he estimated, lasted 3 to 5 minutes. The intensity of the sounds was so great that the boatmen were completely demoralized. And here is taken from the account of Vakulin, the postmaster at Nizhny Ilimsk. At about 8 a.m. on Tuesday, 17 June, a large group of local inhabitants say they first noticed a ball of fire in the northwest, coming down obliquely to the horizon from east to west. When it approached the ground, it changed into a pillar of fire. After its disappearance, a pillar of smoke was seen rising upwards from the ground. A few minutes later, a loud noise was heard with separate deafening crashes like peals of thunder. These crashes were followed by 8 loud bangs like gunshots. The first bang was exceptionally loud and accompanied by a whistling noise. Here's another account from Kokulin, an agriculturist, in a letter to the director of the Irkutsk Observatory. The crash was heard along the Lena River from near Verkholensk to Makatoy, and I'm probably butchering these names, over a distance of about 1,300 versts. Eyewitnesses said that where the body fell, a pillar of black smoke rose up. The Tunguska people wandering around the hamlet of Nizhny Karolynsk say that the thunder was the most terrible they ever heard. So you notice here, you commented, Kyle, that some of this imagery sounded familiar, didn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pillars of fire and smoke.
Right.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I've been kind of taking notes on some of that. It's interesting how some of the other ones, like the sky splitting into the sky opening and fire pouring out, these are pretty cool. But yeah, the pillar of fire and smoke is definitely biblical.
At the beginning of the 9th hour, In the morning, local time, a ball of fire appeared in the sky and moved from southeast to northwest. As the ball approached the ground, it first took on a flattened out shape from top to bottom. And just before it struck the ground, it had the appearance of two pillars of fire. Same idea over and over again. When this fiery mass fell onto the ground, two loud crashes like thunder were heard, and then a noise like a strong wind was heard. Another one, the director of the Kurensk Meteorological Station, in a letter dated June 23rd, 1908. On the 17th of June, in the northwest of Kurensk, an extraordinary phenomenon was observed. At 7:15 a.m., in the northwest, a pillar of fire appeared in the shape of a spear. When the pillar disappeared, 5 loud, sharp bangs as from a cannon followed swiftly and distinctly, one after the other, were heard, and then a dense cloud appeared on that spot. And then we have the account of Obruchev probably, who was actually a geologist traveling near the trading post of Vanavara in 1924. The area of flattened forest is about 4 days' journey away from the mouth of the Shambay River by birch bark boat. That is over 100 kilometers. In winter, it is 3 days' journey by reindeer in a direct line, about 50 to 60 kilometers. The shape of the area on the plan is distorted, but from questions answered, it would appear to be somewhat circular. The forest was completely flattened. The Avanok, Ilya Potapovich, who was living at the time at the trading post at Teterya, 25 kilometers to the southwest of Vanavara, told me that at the spot where the meteorite fell, a pit was formed from which a stream flowed to join the river Shambay. Ilya Potapovich's brother was living in the region at the time of the fall when his tent flew up into the air like a bird, in quotes. Some of his reindeer were killed by the falling trees, and he himself was deprived of speech for several years, as were a number of other people who were so stupefied by what they witnessed that they were unable to speak. Now, this idea that there was a spring or a stream which appeared and flowed forth from the epicenter or near the epicenter, I find to be very interesting. We'll come back to that idea. I think it's a very interesting idea that the shock wave may have actually opened up some subterranean hydrological conduit that then now begin to flow from the surface. And here is the account of Seryachev. And he says, I am a tanner. And in the summer, about 8 a.m., I was washing wool on the bank of the river Kan or Khan. Suddenly, a noise like the fluttering of the wings of a frightened bird was heard coming from a southeasterly direction, and a kind of swell came up the river. After this came a single sharp bang so loud that one of the workmen, Vlaslav, fell into the water. This was followed by several dull bangs like subterranean rumbling. At the first explosion, a kind of radiant body appeared in the air. It was roundish, about half the size of the moon, tinged with blue, and flew swiftly from Filomonova to Irkutsk. It left a trail behind in the form of a pale blue band that stretched over its whole path. So there was a Golashchekin from the village of Kamenskoye on the river Yenisei, 600 kilometers west-southwest of the place of the fall. Reported in a letter on the 30th June 1908 that at 7 a.m. in the village of Kamenskoye, the following phenomena were observed. 3 subterranean thunder crashes sounded from the northwest, one after the other. Some inhabitants felt the ground and buildings shake. From questioning the local inhabitants, he learned that several minutes earlier, some of them had seen, quotes, an elongated body, narrowing towards one end, and more than an hour shine in length, which would have probably made it appear to them to be about 2 to 3 times the diameter of the sun, torn, as it were, from the sun. Its head was as bright as the sun, but the remainder was duller. The body flew across the sky and fell in the northeast. Again, many of the accounts, this is very interesting, torn as it were from the sun. And this is one reason, again, to emphasize why people did not see the thing at first, because for most of the eyewitnesses, the thing was coming from the direction of the sun. So they would have had to have been looking right in the direction of the rising sun, and this is where the thing came out of the sky.